and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I'm your host for this podcast. For this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Victoria McAlister to join us as our guest. Victoria McAlister is Associate Professor of Digital Environmental Humanities at Towson University in Baltimore. And for this coming year, she'll be a long-term fellow at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. She completed graduate education in both history and archaeology, receiving her PhD from Trinity College Dublin, my alma mater. She has taught in the U.S. since 2013, focusing on digital and medieval history. She's the author of The Irish Tower House, Society, Economy, and Environment, circa 1300 to 1650, published in 2019 by Manchester University Press, and is the co-principal investigator of the Human Environmental Exchanges in the Landscape of Medieval Ireland project, known in short form as HELM. She has published and edited works relating to castle studies, landscape history, and digital approaches. Her research has been supported by, among others, the Folger Library, the National Humanities Center, the American Philosophical Society, and the NEH. She's currently finishing a book on animal history and colonization in pre-modern Ireland, and through the HELM project, using drones to investigate disappearing medieval settlements. You can also catch her on the great courses in her course, Great Castles of Europe. Welcome, Vicky. It is a delight to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me, Larissa.
It is a pleasure. Now, castles. Everybody has their idea of castles, and I want to just dive straight into the meat of this discussion and see where it takes us. Can you go ahead and describe more your areas of interest in castles, specifically in Ireland, but also in the broader medieval European scheme?
Yeah, so my interest in castles is not really from an architectural standpoint. It's not really an interest in the castles as buildings themselves. What I'm particularly interested in and what castles can tell us about medieval people and life during medieval times. So in my first book, The Irish Tower House, I really used a type of castle called a tower house as a lens through which to really get to ask bigger questions about what life was like in the later Middle Ages. Tower houses were built by not just the super elites of their society, but also by more people than previously been able to afford to build castles. So wealthy merchants, bishops, people who were up and coming on the social ladder. And so that let me ask a lot of questions about like the societal changes that were taking place in the later Middle Ages from around the time of the Black Death and after. So really, I use castles to look at bigger issues in history and archaeology. For example, the HELM project, the drone project that I work on, oftentimes, well, we start by looking for a castle site and then we search the area around it for where the ordinary people lived, because castles were many things to medieval people. It partially explains why they were built and were in use for so many centuries. And so as a result, a lot of people lived in them, worked around them, were related to them in some way. It isn't just a lord that's involved in a castle. So I really think they're fascinating ways at getting at a bigger picture.
And of course, that's one of the things that most people think about when they think the Middle Ages. They think castles, they think huge, massive castles and sieges and all kinds of siege weapons and the like. But the castles in Ireland are different than other parts of Europe in some ways, depending on the period, are they not? And really, what makes a structure a castle?
Well, so to answer your first point about if Irish castles are different, I would say it's hard to tell. And that's because there's very few unified studies of castles at a pan-European level. The history of castle studies has tended to be very more nationalistic. People have focused on their particular country and they have not really looked at the bigger patterns and how they spread over over big areas. Now, there are some exceptions to that. For example, Tycho Keith is an Irish archaeologist who focuses on castles and Romanesque architecture, and he's interested in the pan-European patterns, and Ollie Crichton over in England has tried to do the same, but it is still quite isolated, in part because of the vast numbers of castles that we're dealing with. So I'm kind of cautious of saying that there's many things about Irish castles that are unique. I mean, there are some quirks to Irish castles for sure. The Tower House in particular is known in Scotland, in the north of England, in frontier regions right across Europe, but not so much from like the south of England or from France. So that is telling us something about their societies, of which Ireland is one. So to go back to your point about what makes a castle, and that is also a difficult thing for us to get to. And really, we kind of know a lot of the time from what it isn't. I tell my students that we can apply a few things. So we're looking for something that is defensive. So that kind of stereotypical image of knights and sieges is correct to a point. But really, I always say to them that the symbolism and the appearance of defense is more important than the actual ability to be defensive. You want to look the part, as was so important during the Middle Ages.
Yeah, basically want to be intimidating, right? It's an intimidation factor in the landscape where you say, all right, you're not going to invade us because we have a big fuck off castle here and we look hard to conquer. Is that the idea?
Yes, absolutely. And then there's so many other things that come through with the messaging in that regard. I am a mighty lord, don't mess with me. Or if people have just been granted their lands, then it's a way for them to be like stamp their power and authority on the landscape. So that is a really big part of it. But of course, then somebody needs to live there at the end of the day. It needs to be a residence. If it's not a residence, then it's just a military barracks. So somebody actually needs to call it home. The other thing that people often forget, and probably our medieval lords would have forgotten as well, is that it was a huge administrative centre, which is the bit that I'm most interested in, to be quite honest, because that lets us get at like the lens of more people. But for example, they were the sites of courts where people paid their taxes. There was a lot of administrative interaction with castles. They controlled a huge area of land. They were the focal point within a bigger landscape. The other things I'd also say is that they needed to be private to a certain extent, so not like a communal fortification, you know, like a citadel or a place of refuge for an entire town. There's those in Italy. We tend not to call them castles, so they're a bit on the spectrum of castle-like. And the other thing that I would definitely say is that they need to be from the Middle Ages. So the most obvious, not a castle, but everybody thinks is a castle, is therefore Neuschwanstein, because it was the inspiration for the Disney castle. When I ask people to imagine what a castle looks like, they tend to think of the turrets and the fiddly bits, and it's usually this Neuschwanstein influence, but it's from the 19th century. It was built by Bavarian King Ludwig. Yeah, it's supposed to look medieval, but it's not. It's not actually a castle. It's not
a medievalism.
A society.
Right, it's medievalism.
Exactly.
And of course, I have a friend and a colleague who was once tasked with finding pictures of medieval castles for a film, and she very famously said she kept bringing them pictures of actual medieval castles, and they're like, no, that's not it. No, that's not it. Until she brought them a picture of Neuschwanstein, and they're like, yes, that's it. And she's like, no, but okay. But because that is the image. People see fantasy, they see Disney, they see Disneyland, Disney World, and they have that idea of Cinderella's castle, but that's a medievalism. It's a 19th century impression of what they want the Middle Ages to have looked like. So for a castle, though, it does vary, does it not, on where it is and its specific purpose and its specific geographical landscape placement, yes?
Yes. And so a lot of things that we consider castles are not what people conjure in their minds like castles. And probably the best example of that are what we call the earth and timber castles, which people might have heard of the term motte and bailey before. So the motte is the mound, and then the bailey is the attached enclosure. There didn't actually have to be a bailey, and you can just get a motte on its own, but people often have heard of a motte and bailey. And then there's another type of earth and timber castle called a ringwork. And so I prefer to call it earth and timber, and many scholars do, because it reminds us that we're just looking at the earth bits of it today, rather than an earthwork castle. Really, the most of the castle has gone. It was made of timber. It doesn't survive. It's organic. It's rotted over the years. There's some actually do survive out in Poland or being reconstructed that are timber, but the vast majority of these timber castles don't survive. And when I show a picture to students or talks or whoever of what the earth parts of these earth and timber castles look like, I'm like, would you say this is a castle? And they're like, no, that's a ditch.
Right, because people expect it to be stone, right? People expect castles. And I may have said that in my first episode, in which case, mea culpa. But this idea that a castle is stone, so obviously that is erroneous.
It is. And another thing that we're starting to explore, and I've been interested in as an environmental historian, is the issue of deforestation. That is deforestation, woodland management. These are not new things that are unique to modernity. Medieval people had huge demand for wood. They needed it for cooking, for heat, for industrial work, and of course for building things. So getting really high quality building timber, we think actually would have been a really expensive and difficult pursuit. So the evidence now that we're looking at it in a new way seems to be that actually medieval people were very impressed by a fancy timber building showing off a lot of expensive wood because they knew that it was difficult for them to get. So yeah, we while it doesn't survive, we think that probably a fair number of castles were made out of timber, and it's not a case of people then being like, well, stone is better and I'm going to level up to stone. There's plenty of evidence that very powerful lords, even kings, stayed in timber castles. There's great examples from Wales, for example. There's a poem by Iolo Goch, and he talks about the court of one of the Welsh princes, and he goes into great detail, and it was a wooden castle. It was built of timber, but he goes into great detail about how stunning it was.
So that's an interesting point, because if you think about particularly the pre-conquest era in England before 1066. And this idea, of course, that there were long houses, there were long halls like Edoras in that we see in Tolkien, which is based on Heorot and Beowulf. What's the difference then between one of those big, massive halls and a castle if it's not a question of construction materials or even so much the placement, because something like Heorot was on a hill, a headland, even though Denmark is mostly flat. But what makes that a hall versus a castle?
Well, we're back to the functions there. Is it defensive, residential, administrative? The other element that I did not tackle, and that we have a difficult relationship is the role or not of what I again call my students the bad F word, which that makes me laugh because I think I'm going to drop an F-bomb, and I'm like, no, feudalism. So a lot of the time our sort of background that we're like about engaging with, because it is of course massively problematic, and of course a later term than in the Middle Ages, is whether you needed a feudal society for castles. Are they reflecting a new way of dividing up land and holding land and social obligations between different ranks of people? And certainly that is an undercurrent, whether we want to engage openly with these debates or not.
So I'm going to ask you then, because I'm familiar with the debate about feudalism, but can you explain a bit why that has become a more problematic term as modern scholars have evolved in their research? Because it is, again, one of those things that most people think about when they think Middle Ages. They're like, oh, feudalism, we know that top-down system. So can you explain the debate and why that's problematic? And then, of course, that explains better for my audience why castles are castles.
Yeah. So I suppose that the most pertinent issue is that it's not a medieval term. It's a term that first appears in the 17th century to describe something that was going much earlier. And of course, when people are writing after the Middle Ages, they usually have a vested interest in making the Middle Ages look bad because they want to point out how they are not medieval, they are not backwards and barbaric and all the rest.
They're enlightened or they're Renaissance. Yes.
Right. It's rebirth. It's different. Sure. So that is part of the word. It's not a term that medieval people used, and therefore that becomes so. It's a theory like any other theory, and therefore it becomes okay. So, what extent does this actually exist? This is an idealized system. Was this actually how things worked, literally on the ground? And the evidence is kind of, but not massively. Also, it expects places and time periods to be very uniform. And of course, Europe as a whole around the year 1000 is dramatically different from Europe around the year 1500. Things have really changed by then. For example, we might emphasize how in feudalism you owed military service to your lord in exchange for your land. But quite often you paid for somebody else to do the military service, or you paid the lord money to hire somebody to do it. So that was something that very much changed over a few hundred years. And then, of course, you've got different places. So was France after the Carolingians more feudal than Ireland? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not even sure to what extent feudalism even existed in Ireland when the Anglo/Cambro-Normans arrived. Sure, they might have had great ideas of doing what they did back in England and in Normandy and Ireland, but did it actually happen based on numbers, opposition, and the rest on the ground in Ireland? Well, that is the debate.
And that brings up an interesting question and an important one, because my last episode, I did mention that most castles in Ireland date from the Norman conquest. But is that entirely accurate? I mean, we also have that question about England, because 1066, the assumption is William comes over, plants castles as part of his colonial conquest, as part of his conquest of the island, to go, I am planting these big old stone buildings as a reminder of my power and consolidation of power. But is that an entirely accurate description of how castles are built, or why they're built, or when they're built?
It is to a certain extent, but it's very hard to date castles, even though they are built by the real power players of their contemporary societies. A lot of them, we don't know who built them, how long it took them, how much it cost, or any of the mundane stuff like that, because the records don't survive. The records of the people don't survive. So, for example, for looking at England in the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror, William of Normandy, we do know about the castles that he built because he had so much documentation surviving around him. And so he had this overarching goal where he built a lot of his castles, as you said, out of stone. And he tended to build them in urban locations because he had a colonization message to send around England. But the castles that the people in the tiers beneath him built, we might not know about them. And therefore, we're back to, if we don't have documents, do we date them based on their architecture? Well, then we can, but oftentimes we're dealing with very long time periods there. We can be like, oh, yes, it's Romanesque, it's Gothic, or they used this type of stone in this century. But we're probably getting to a period of decades, and that makes it difficult combined to try and securely date a lot of castles. The likelihood is that, yes, there were castles in both Ireland and England before the Normans arrived, but can we be absolutely sure? It's iffy. In the case of Ireland, we think that there were some castles built out in Connaught by the O'Connors and the High Kings, but we're basing that a lot of the time based on the written descriptions, and medieval people are pretty loosey-goosey with the terms that they use to describe castles. You know, everything is a castle. Everything is castellum. for
Right.
the Lyceum. And so we're coming back and being like, oh, what actually is this? And so sometimes we're like, well, medieval peoples called them castles, so it must be a castle. Sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. So we have a whole host of problems with being able to securely identify those, except to say that it's likely there were. They were likely earth and timber castles, like I described, but they're probably also not that much earlier than the Normans either. We're probably talking 10 years, maybe at most 20 years. So certainly castles become very popular around the same time across Europe, and then that goes back into do you need, what comes first, chicken or the egg? Is it feudalism or castles?
Right. Well, and of course, if you consider the whole process of conquest, there is this sense that there was never a Norman ever in Ireland before the rest of them came over with Strongbow. Or even when William comes over to England in 1066. And of course, the whole dynastic question of the Norman conquest in England, William's family, that's the whole problem. It is a family dynastic dispute because Edward the Confessor didn't have an heir, and he promised it to both Harold and he promised it to William. And they argued. And basically, Harold's like, yeah, well, I'm here. And William's like, hold my beer, and off he goes. It's not like they're totally separate people who were not connected beforehand. And it's not like there wasn't traffic from Normandy to England, or even potentially Ireland and the continent before the Norman conquest.
I mean, that's why I use castles to get in a bigger picture, and I'm really interested in trade routes. And if we look at the evidence for trade around castles, it's very conclusive. There's a lot of and in the early Middle Ages in Ireland, particularly urban areas, but really across Ireland, there's a lot of evidence for trade with the continent. It's not the continent is very known to Ireland, and vice versa.
And of course, this is something that we saw in Wood Quay in that massive excavation in Dublin when they were building the ugliest building in Dublin, the massive big corporation building next to Christchurch, and poured concrete.
Ugliest and most offensive.
Yeah, exactly. It's the ugliest and the most offensive. It's that idea of aesthetically, if you just look at it on its own, sure, it's a nice modern structure, but when you realize what they did to build it, absolutely,
it's next level.
It really is. And I mean, that's one of the things about Ireland, though, is that you really can't dig a hole without finding something of historical or archaeological value. So can you talk about the wide range of archaeological evidence that exists in Ireland, and what kind of problem does that pose for modern archaeologists and historians?
So a huge amount of archaeology in Ireland has been driven by infrastructural development. So if any of the listeners or viewers have been to Ireland in the last 20, 25 years, they'll have noticed that Ireland has a lot more motorways or interstate equivalents than it used to. And that is because Ireland, from the mid-90s, I would say, well, first we entered the Celtic Tiger, and now we are in after the recession, everything has bounced back, and some people call it the Celtic Phoenix as a result. But the upshot is that Ireland is a wealthy, developed country, and it is an island, and it wants to upgrade its infrastructure. And so, yes, when you start building roads or laying down new pipelines or putting in high-speed internet, you have to dig holes, and then you start to find archaeology. So there is a huge amount of what we would call rescue archaeology or infrastructural development-led archaeology, where in the process of constructing all of this, they have found an awful lot of information about the archaeology of Ireland. Probably the best example I can think of is outside of Waterford City, where they were putting in a road around the city, and they found Woodstown, a Viking settlement. So earlier than the castle period, but they were like, oh, this is a huge amount of Viking finds, Viking skeletons. And they ended up just being like, okay, we're just going to divert the road. This is too big.
Okay. So they didn't
Yeah,
bother to pick it
this
up
is
and pour
too
concrete.
big for us to deal with. And so they just diverted the road, and we're like, they dug up a little bit of it to be like, oh, very big Viking settlement, and diverted the road, and have left most of it. So I suppose there's how our attitudes have changed since Wood Quay, and today we're like, okay, where we can, we want to leave it alone, because once you excavate, you destroy. It's gone forever. It's so if you find something amazing like Wood Quay, once it was excavated, well, it's not there anymore. We've got the artifacts maybe, and the different techniques that were used to study it, but there's also an understanding that scientific methods are forever gaining. We're getting new ways to learn about the past, and so there is a reticence to excavate. Because leaving it alone might be better for our knowledge in the long term as well. But the upshot of all this, especially the roads, is if you look at like the distribution maps of where the excavations are and the sites, and also like the aerial imaging, the LiDAR, high-tech different readings of the landscape, they tend to follow where the roads went and other infrastructure.
Well, that raises another very important question, because I mean, if you've ever seen any episode of like Time Team, and they're like, oh, we've uncovered it, but now we're covering it back up again. And for a lot of people who aren't familiar with archaeological process, or even what it takes or what happens when you start to dig things up, I'm sure your average person's like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you excavate? Why wouldn't you dig that up? And so can you, as you say, it destroys it to dig it up. So does that mean we never get the full picture, or is that where the drone research comes in?
Yeah, well, I think that we've learned in many ways from our past mistakes, like Wood Quay, and that we appreciate that was a missed opportunity. There were so many finds uncovered that you could spend lifetimes studying the finds and never articulate them, publish them. And certainly that was an issue with the infrastructural development in Ireland from the Celtic Tiger and afterwards, is they're producing huge amounts of material. It's growth, growth, growth. When does the knowledge get published? When does the knowledge reach the public? That you can't just excavate and then keep it to yourself and keep it to the people who are actually on site. There's an obligation to teach people about it and have people learn about the history of the place. And then that's very time consuming. Writing things up, publishing is very time consuming, and people have many other things that they need to do. Um, so there is this debate over making results from excavations accessible to not just other academics and other archaeologists, but to the wider public as well. So yeah, and then once you dig, and I mean, in the case of excavation, once you dig and you lift things out, they've lost their context, and that's why a lot of archaeologists are opposed to metal detecting, for example, is because metal detectors are interested in the finds, and they dig those up and destroy the context around. And archaeologists are a lot of the time more interested in the context than the find themselves. They're less interested in the shiny, and more like, well, where did it come from? Did it come from a house? What type of house is this? Was it a farm? What is the bigger contextual picture from where this was recovered?
And of course,
yeah.
I was to say, if you think about places like Iceland, as you know, they were recovering from the 2008 economic crash that hit Iceland really, really hard. And they developed these ideas of, okay, we're going to turn these old warehouses or these old fishing warehouses into hotels and boutique hotels. And they're digging up in Reykjavik, and they found unbelievable sites of longhouses. And what they did in particularly one case, and I've been there, but I've forgotten the name of the hotel. They built the hotel on top of it, but in such a way that they left the roundhouse archaeology in situ. They created a museum around the roundhouse itself underneath the hotel. And they have glass panels in the floor so that when you walk into the hotel, you can see down into the longhouse. And from the outside, you can actually go into this museum of the longhouse. So they left it all in situ and built the hotel anyway, without doing any damage to the actual structure itself.
Yeah, they did that in Dublin actually recently, with part of the medieval city on Ainger Street. I can't remember if it's the Aldi or the Lidl on Ainger Street, where they put a glass floor in, and you can see the medieval parts of the city underneath.
I missed that. Next time I go back, I'm going to have a look at that.
Yeah, it's up. Yeah, it's on the top of Ainger Street, and they were building the new supermarket and found medieval house, and did that, put a glass floor in. So when you go in and do your shopping, you're walking on a glass floor, and the medieval house is underneath from medieval Dublin.
And of course, a city like Dublin has multiple layers of historical and
Yes.
archaeology in the first place. So any kind of renovation, any kind of construction is going to inevitably unearth something. And of course, one of the very controversial ones was the motorway in the Boyne Valley, was it not, that was supposed to go around the hill of Tara.
Yes.
So here's a question, though, of course, back to castles. Tara, seat of high kings, has Leothal, the Stone of Destiny, but it doesn't have a castle, does it? Or does it?
No, there's a lot around there. There's a lot of castles around there. Yes.
So can you explain it? Because if you look at it and if you go, it looks like a series of hills. Maybe those are the mottes. I don't know. So can you explain what are the castle sites at Tara? So how can they find out more about Tara and what is a castle and what is not a castle?
So there's a great resource for Ireland, which is in Europe and most countries in the world, the government keeps a sites and monuments record. So they keep a list of all the archaeological sites in the country, and of course it's updated as new technologies and excavation find new things. So if any of your listeners are interested in finding out more, then for the Republic of Ireland, they only need to go to www.archaeology.ie, and that is the website. And then they can click through to a thing called the Historic Environment Viewer, and then this is a map-based application where they can see where all of the archaeological sites in Ireland are. So I am actually, while I'm talking to you, pulling up around Tara.
And I will post a link to this on the YouTube page as well as on Substack and Patreon.
Yes. So when I you need to know the place, or you can search by the type of structure you're interested in. So you can totally pull up all of the castles within a particular county and then wade through the several thousand that appear. So let me see. So when you get to around Tara, it gets very dot-like because of all the archaeological sites around.
So with Tara, is it a castle? It's a royal site, most definitely. But are there any motte and baileys in Tara? As you look at that archaeological listing online, and I'll include those links, what do you find?
So there's no castle right there, but there's lots and lots of castles in that part of Ireland and in Meath. What's interesting though at Tara is you've got the royal site, there's all sorts of prehistoric burials, and right by it is a medieval church though. So you can see how there are many ways for people in history to make their claim, stamp their claim to a landscape. So we've got Tara in more western, and then we go further east and we get to the Neolithic sites of Newgrange or Knowth or Dowth. And there's a lot of castles there. In fact, right by Dowth, there's it looks like the barrow was converted into a motte at one point, and then there's a Tower House castle right next to the site as well. So it's multiple periods of use over thousands of years.
So basically what would have happened is that a lord or whoever owned that land would build an actual castle structure on a pre-existing Neolithic barrow. They would use what was already there.
Exactly. Because if you think about it, it's a lot of effort and money to build a castle. So why not get a head start by using something that's already there, even if it is a Neolithic barrow? Plus, then there's the symbolism involved. Oh, yes, well, this has been in the landscape for thousands of years. You have your beliefs and rituals about it, but I'm going to take it for my own purposes now.
And I'm going to
associate it with me.
Right. And you're going to basically just plant something on top of it and go, mine now.
Yes.
So that's where all the signification comes from. Now, of course, Ireland is full of ring forts, but those ring forts that are stone would have had other structures around them too, but those are much, much older than the Middle Ages, are they not?
Yeah, so the ring forts, there's the earth ones that we often call rats, and then there's the stone ones, like you mentioned. We often call them castles. And there are different theories that they were occupied and served like a castle equivalent on into later in the Middle Ages. And there have been a lot of excavations, at least, of ring forts, and some of them have shown evidence from the finds and artifacts of medieval occupation. So what we think about the ring forts is that they were built and used over hundreds of years, through from the Iron Age, certainly the early Middle Ages, and then on into the Middle Ages as well. There is some evidence that some of them, not all of them, were still used in the time of castle building. So we're still trying to sort out that chronology. Did this serve a parallel function for the Gaelic Irish in Ireland? And another interesting type of monument in that regard is the Crannog. So the fortified island, and there's thousands of those in Ireland. And again, the archaeology shows that they are occupied in prehistory, in the Iron Age. But again, the archaeology does show, and also the historical documentations and like Elizabethan period maps, that they were also occupied right up until the 17th century. So basically, a good rule of thumb is if it works and it's in a good location, people are going to continue using it for as long as possible.
Especially if it's stone, because you don't want to have to redo or recreate the effort and the labor it takes to bring all of those stones. If you've already got a nice ring fort with that's essentially a stone wall, why not use it? And a crannog, of course, is an island, so it's defensible because it's an island, yes?
Yes, although they would have put extra walls and wooden palisades around it. Actually, there is a downside to building in stone that makes them pretty susceptible in the long term, and that is when they stop being used and they're very high quality building stone. It's kind of easier for people to go and steal the stone out of it and build their own houses than it is to go and pay for it and get it all done from a professional stonemason yourself. So robbing of stone is a problem with archaeological sites. My grandmother had a stone wall in her backyard, and the story was that it came from the old jail, but that the old jail had used a castle for its stone. So that is it's true, several instances of reuse and stone theft.
Reuse, otherwise robbing, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, but they're like, this is great stone. And especially if you look at the corners of castles, stone castles, originally they would have had coin stones, very large, maybe slightly worked cornerstones. But if you look at a lot of castle ruins, the corners of castles are jaggedy and uneven, and that's because people tended to steal those first, because they were the big, nice, fancy ones that they could get the most use out of.
It's funny. And of course, now, if we talk about castles and structures, the landscape and the environmental situation of a castle is very important. But before we go on to the environmental history part of this, I do want to ask you about bogs, because of course I mentioned bog bodies, and there'll be some photos up on Patreon of some of the bog bodies in the National Museum of Ireland. But bogs, of course, and throwing things in bogs. People threw things in bogs for a very long time. In fact, there are artifacts and full suits of clothing in the National Museum in Ireland that were found in a bog. In one case, the full suit of clothing was found on a body thrown into a bog. So where does bog archaeology fit into your work, especially when it comes to environmental research?
Yeah, so it's less that castles are built in bogs. They tend not to build castles in bogs because it's not really going to work. There are things that
like
are
Monty
built in.
Python.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, you might use a bit of a bog around your castle, maybe, because it's not just, we might think, oh, it's defensive. Who wants to wade through a bog? But also, to go back to this, medieval people had a lot of need for fuel. Medieval people also used the bogs and cut turf for it. And there's rights of turbery that we get in medieval deeds and different medieval agreements. So medieval people used the bogs for many different uses. So there might be near a castle, but we tend not to have them built in bogs. It tends to be trying to keep things out of the bogs. Like roads tend to be raised above the bogs, and we find them when we excavate the bogs. trying to keep people out of the bogs. So they use the bogs, but they don't want to be in the bogs. But as you pointed out, the bog preserves things, and people did know this. But nowadays, we also know this. So there are many things that we can use from a scientific perspective, again, for this context of castles. So while bogs preserve clothes, people, artifacts, it also preserves all organic materials. So that means things like tree pollen, what we call macrofossils, so bits of plants. They also preserve volcanic ash. So if anything falls basically on the ground, the bog is going to accumulate slowly over time, and it's going to preserve in a layer all of this. So what some scientists do is look at, they dig a core through the bog, pull it up. It's got a stratigraphy, so it's got different layers, and we can assume that at the top is most recent, and that going further down is getting us older in time period. They can look at what appears in different layers in this core, and by looking at the types of pollen that are picked up in a microscope, they can say what the landscape around the bog was like. Likewise, if they have a layer of volcanic ash, those tended to come from Iceland, then they know when the volcano erupted. It gives them a secure date for being able to date changes in the landscape, or these different finds that come out of the bogs too.
But it also gives you a sense of agricultural development and agricultural production that in many respects contradicts some of the written sources, especially when we're talking about a colonial era, when you have texts whose entire purpose is to say, right, those people are barbarians and we need to take them over. They're so much better off if we conquer them, because they're not doing X, Y, and Z. They're not doing agriculture. They don't know their arse from their elbow when it comes to actually raising anything. But the archaeological record that comes from those core samples in the environment often contradict that idea, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. So there's lots of examples of this where the likes of Gerald of Wales or the Tudor conquerors are like, oh, well, Irish people are just so backwards. And mainly they say that they don't grow crops, that they're obsessed with cattle and they're itinerant.
Or they have werewolves, because that's Gerald of Wales.
Yes, of course. So they have a vested interest in making Irish people look bad, and they tend to go for this old trope of, well, they don't farm the land. And of course, that is a colonial trope across the board, famously in Australia, where they used it to dispossess the Aboriginal population. And it's a very standard colonial trope. And then when we look at the evidence from the environmental archaeology, it shows that actually there were crops being grown around these bog areas in a time period that we can scientifically show was before the Norman conquest or the Tudor conquest. That we can see that in this otherwise very Irish part of Ireland, yes, they were growing crops, and these were likely the crops based on sometimes the things associated with the crops themselves, but quite commonly they look at the weeds, the pollen from the weeds that grow in the shoulders, the unused parts of agricultural fields, and are saying, well, yes, there's huge wheat fields here because we can see the weeds that like growing alongside wheat here.
So the archaeology is very important for kind of dispelling those myths of colonial need. I mean, you see the same thing in the United States with that whole question of indigenous people, where they say, well, indigenous people, American Indians, did not grow things. They were hunter-gatherers, in some way to imply that somehow these societies were less sophisticated, they were less evolved. And of course, that's bollocks. It's nonsense, because every civilization has its own means of crop production as necessary for food, because you can't just sustain hunter-gatherer entirely. And of course, this idea of growing things becomes very important in the colonial domination of Ireland in the Middle Ages, does it not?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it is across the board. Colonial writers love to make a big deal over this because they see growing a crop as a more secure claim to the land. And of course, they don't want the people who are already there to have a secure claim to the land. So the archaeology is very valuable in that regard for overturning the myths that you get in the written record. And providing a different perspective oftentimes. For example, I'm just thinking about the excellent work done on plantation era archaeology in Ireland. For example, the work by Audrey Horning found that the archaeology showed there was quite a lot of interaction between the colonizers and the Irish, and not just in a violent regard. There's examples of them drinking together and trade, and she found evidence that they were having the Irish build them their houses, even though they weren't actually supposed to. The terms and conditions of their land grant was that they were supposed to build in a house in an English style, that they weren't necessarily following through on what the written documentation needed to say, because the written documentation is the ideal, and the reality once you get somewhere is often very different.
Well, and of course, the plantation period is the 17th century. That comes in the Scottish plantation, or rather the plantation of Scottish Protestants into particularly Northern Ireland, into the upper counties of Northern Ireland. That whole colonial control is all about, we're going to write this down as instructions because A, this is what we want you to do, but also people aren't doing it. So we have to keep writing it down. We have to keep saying, you need to do this. No, this was the rule. We wrote it down. You needed to do this. And so what you're seeing is that an awful lot of the physical artifacts and the physical evidence contradicts what's in writing.
Yes. It does. And yes, so they keep making these statements. They also keep learning from what went before. So the plantation in the north is probably the most famous, but it also ties in with castle building, because these colonizers were building and using castles as part of this effort too. And in Ireland, castles do stretch quite late. They stretch on into the 17th century. I think the last security datable one I could find when I was writing my book for one that was built was in 1636 or 1640 or something like that. So we're well into the 17th century and they're still building castles, never mind still using and occupying castles, because that same messaging that the Normans took, I'm going to build my castle on top of your earlier site, also works really well in the 16th and 17th century. I'm going to take over a castle that one of your lords had, and I'm going to live in it because I'm your new lord, and I want you to feel my power and know that this transition has taken place. A great example, if people are interested in learning more, is Kilcolman Castle in Cork, which is being studied by Tom Heron. And I was also involved in the 3D reconstruction aspect of that castle, but it's a great example of this. It was owned and occupied by the Renaissance poet Edmund Spenser, who was an absolute colonist in all these negative senses of the terms. He advocated for genocide. He was like, let's just kill them all.
Yeah, he hated the Irish and the Irish hated him.
Correct. Yes. So we have the castle is a reconstruction because the Irish burned his castle because of all of this. But before, he didn't build it. He just lived in it. It was there before, and it was the local Irish lord's castle. And he went in to live in it because he wanted to send a message. If we were able to sit Edmund Spenser down and interview him, he'd probably think that an Irish castle was beneath him, but the practicalities of a colonial mindset meant that it was very handy for him too. But that is called Centering Spenser or Castle, and we've got the 3D castle reconstruction there too.
And it's an excellent reconstruction. And of course, as a literary historian, I've done quite a lot of work on Edmund Spenser himself, and the aspects of Irishness that he includes in his epic 1590 Faerie Queene. He still hated the Irish, but he was certainly happy to profit in any way he could because he was sent to Ireland. Probably not entirely of his own free will, but Elizabeth said go, and he went, because that's what you do. And of course, this is part of the wave of New English settlement in the 16th century. That's the Tudor kind of colonization of Ireland. And those castles, a lot of the castles, the tower houses that survive from that period, do they not?
The tower houses are very difficult to date because they tend to be quite architecturally simple. And the types of people who are building them, it's not just kings. It's a much bigger grouping of people can afford to build these smaller towers. So they're even less documented than the great Anglo-Norman masonry castles, or even the mottes, and the likes. And there's thousands of them across Ireland. I surveyed over 200 for my book, and that's like less than 1%, I think. It sounds impressive until you put it into the bigger perspective. It was a tiny amount of how many we think survive. So it is very hard to know about them. We think they probably began to be constructed in the 14th century, and then they're built right through until the middle of the 17th century.
Blarney
But
Castle is one of those, is it not? Blarney
yes, it
Castle
is.
one of the
Absolutely.
tower houses.
It is a tower house. So that one is a very large, ornate example. Some of them are very, very small and very plain and are really like one room at each level. So there's a huge amount of variety in them as well. But they're usually quite, when I say quite plain, I mean that like usually it's just a tower. Usually somebody is stolen the windows out of it, or if they've gone for a more inexpensive style of window that we can't necessarily date beyond saying, oh, this is Tudor period. And of course, again, people lived in them for hundreds of years, and so we've plenty of examples of a tower house was built, people were living in it. Fireplaces become the done thing to have in your house. Well, then they're going to add fireplaces in their older home. So you've got architecture and features that are later in date in earlier structures as well, just to complicate things for us.
And in 1998, I went on a road trip with an American friend of mine in Ireland, and we ended up visiting and staying in some of those tower houses that are now B&Bs, because they have again repurposed them or refurbished them or just kind of updated them a bit. And there was actually one that was a tower house that was owned by Sir Walter Raleigh, and the owner was a lovely older gentleman of Indian descent who'd bought it and had been in his family for a number of, probably about 10, 20 years at this point, but he updated it to recreate that 16th century aesthetic, and he was basically opening it as a bed and breakfast. And so, I mean, the tower houses that are still there, if you can live in it, you can see that they could be quite comfortable. They've got wood paneling, they've got their tapestries. People think of castles as just bare stone, cold and drafty, yes, but nobody was going to live in that.
No, that's the other thing. When we were saying about the timber, and you have to imagine, or at least make an educated reconstruction as to what the timber castles look like. Actually, that goes for the stone as well. And the interiors of castles don't tend to survive. So we're not entirely sure of what all was in a castle. We need to use in particular wills to try and get an idea as to what people had furniture-wise, belongings-wise in their houses. But yeah, the medieval people probably didn't see the stone either. At the very least, they would have put lime wash on it, and that would have been for waterproofing. Also, it has a disinfecting property to it. It would brighten up a dark room. So yeah, medieval people probably didn't see the stone. At the very least, they would have painted it, lime washed it, and then put, as you say, wood paneling or tapestries for insulation. And again, in tower houses, we've got some examples of wall paintings as well, where people did murals and wall paintings on the tower house. And then on the outside, that would have been the case as well. We think that stone castles probably would have had quite a lot of timber and wood on them, in addition to the stone. So maybe exterior halls, additions, or even just the roof and maybe some hoarding around the top for access to move around the top of the castle. So again, we have to guess what that looked like. We see castles today as being grey and stone, but manuscript images do show them being white. Not necessarily grey. So they would have been whitewashed on the outside. And of course, Jeremy Irons's castle is Kilcoe Castle. It's a tower house, and it oxidized in the lime wash oxidized and has gone this like salmon pink color, orangey pink shade. And even if it was white, or even whether it was pink, that certainly would have been eye-catching at a lot of distances in the Middle Ages.
And then, of
Against
course,
green, boom, castle.
right. And of course, there are accounts of castles shining on a hill and being
Mhm.
visible. And that was likely because they were lime washed or painted with some kind of pigment. I know that Stirling Castle in Scotland, they were actually doing this in the 1990s where they were painting the Great Hall on the outside, kind of this yellowy lime wash, so that it really did, when the sun hit it, because the sun does occasionally shine in Scotland, it looked like it was a golden castle on the hill. And that
Mhm.
was where you get all of those literary accounts of these bright, shining castles, because they did, because they were
Yes.
meant to catch your eye. And a lot of people have that same impression of cathedrals where they assume it was all gray and all dark. But all evidence has shown in both the records of pigmentation and restoration, as well as just buying materials, that a lot of stone buildings, churches, were actually painted on the inside. And they've done some of that work in Durham Cathedral too. So castles are not just those dark gray, what we see as
Okay.
ruins.
Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly. But I want to turn to your drone research. So can you
Mhm.
explain, because everybody knows what drones are, and drones are everywhere now, and drones have a multitude of uses. Can you explain how drones help you as both an archaeologist and a historian recreate that castle landscape imagery?
Yeah, so what we do in the Helm project is we collect a type of digital data called photogrammetry data from our drone. So what it actually does is the drone goes up and it takes thousands of photographs of the ground underneath it, and these all overlap to a certain extent. It also takes like a GPS, a location reading. What we then take is these thousands of images and make a combined image in computer programs of all of these thousands of images together and make one sort of master image. And then what we can do is run all of this through computer programs, particularly ArcGIS, and start to manipulate in digital methods how the landscape looks, and try and sort of add maybe more artificial views to throw into clearer perspective what is at ground level. So we do not dig, we don't go underground. If you want to look at what's under the ground, then you either need to dig or you need to use geophysics, geophysical prospecting to get readings of what is going on underneath the ground. What you can do with drones and photogrammetry data, or the very similar LiDAR data, which is light-based radar, is you're getting a reading of the ground. But because you're taking so many different readings and images, and then you put it into the computer program, what you're picking up are very, 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 very slight changes in the topography, in the level of the ground, that you might not be able to see with the human eye, or in archaeology with the human foot, since we talk oftentimes about humpy bumpies. And when we walked across this field, we could feel something. So our feet are as important as our eyes in many regards when you're doing a landscape-based survey. So you oftentimes can't see it when you're physically there. But when you put it into a computer program, you can see that 1 centimeter fluctuation in the landscape, and you might be able to color it a bit differently than it surrounds, and all of a sudden things that we might not have been able to see previously can now be seen. So in our project, we don't always, but we often work with castles because we're interested in what was going on around them. And so using our project, we have looked mainly to find the settlements associated with castles, so where the ordinary people lived around castles, whether they worked in the castles or were just dependent on it as a centre of an estate. Or in the case of the Anglo-Normans, they often would do these planned settlements where they plan to import good, loyal English people and put them in the land in Ireland. And we can see the settlements, the remnants of them doing this, even though it just looks like a flat green field today. And the other thing we can often see are old field systems and agricultural uses. But we're particularly interested in refining ways to be able to see where the ordinary people were living. And we've been really successful at finding the houses and the property plots of where these people lived And it tends to be outside a castle and particularly near a church as well. So that kind of dual religious and secular power seems to encourage people to live near them.
So does that mean that, of course, considering what you said earlier about not digging things up because you don't want to destroy it, do you use the drone research to then dig to find artifacts, or do you just do the drone research to get that better picture?
Well, we just use it to get the better picture, but other scholars use it as more of an integrated approach where they combine the drones with the geophysics, and then they use that for more targeted excavations. So it is part of an increasing toolkit that archaeologists use, but we're interested in not disturbing it because once you dig it up, it's gone.
It's
So
gone.
we're really interested in trying to determine how much we can find out without having to excavate. Now, of course, we're going to miss things like artifacts, small finds, which are so valuable for giving us an idea about how people lived and also dating. But we think we've been pretty successful at answering questions because what we do is we combine this archaeological digital information with the available written record. And so we can look at an account from, say, the Tudor period or the dissolution of the monasteries, and it says, well, at this castle, there's 20 houses. And we can be like, oh, yes, we can match this up. So we know that at this time period, there were 20 houses. And what we see are, well, there's a lot more than 20 houses in our images. So we know that it must have shrunken by the time it gets to that period. So we can combine the different sources of evidence to get a pretty good picture, even without going to the traditional excavation methods.
And so this kind of leads me to the kind of the last overarching question as we kind of wrap up here. But how does interdisciplinary work, especially in history and archaeology, inform our views about the medieval past? And how does it help us understand our present and potentially change the future?
That's a great question. And I am biased. To go back to that issue of bias, I am biased in that I think that it's very important to be interdisciplinary for the so many examples we've given in this chat, that it's giving us a more rounded picture. Sometimes we're contradicting, and contradicting tells us more. It lets us get at ordinary people or even a lot of very elite people who aren't documented. But at the same time, it's hard to do. I had to go out and deliberately get graduate school training in both. I had to learn Latin and had to learn to read documents, but I also had to learn how to read scientific polygraphs, for example, and not necessarily do the science myself, but be able to understand it and interpret it. So it is hard to combine all of these different things. But I think that how it informs us going forward, and again, I'm biased here, but I think that understanding how people lived in the Middle Ages can help us understand how we live today. In particular, I think there's some amount of greenwashing, to borrow a modern term, with how we view people in the Middle Ages, that we view them as being much more in tune with their land and medieval people. And this is kind of a Renaissance thing as well, that they were in harmony with their land. They were a bit backwards. They were nasty and violent and covered in mud and
living in the forests and living off the land
and all the rest.
Yeah.
And you see the stuff like, oh, well, they didn't cut down trees because they thought that spirits lived in them, and it's like, oh god, no, they did. Good tree's a good tree at the end of the day. And so personally in my own research, I've argued that, well, actually the Middle Ages is a testing ground for a lot of what came later, whether it's the colonization that we've discussed, or certainly how people interacted with their environment and how people responded to huge historical events that is very relevant to us today. We tend to think about climate change as being a modern thing, but medieval people had to deal with climate change, albeit not man-made. They had the medieval climate anomaly where everything was a little bit warmer than usual, and then around the year 1300 or around the year 1850 they had the Little Ice Age where everything is a bit colder than usual. and a bit more unstable. There's certainly periods within the Little Ice Age of freak weather, such as we get in abundance today. And so there's a lot of people who are using interdisciplinary studies of how medieval people responded to these things to try and better understand how we can be more resilient in our own problems and the things that we face.
Do you find that that has kind of the opposite effect as well, where people try to say, but look, the climate changed back in the Middle Ages. They had a mini ice age then. Climate change now is just a natural phenomenon. Do you find that people distort what the archaeology and the history and the reality of the Middle Ages is in order to just feed their modern political narratives?
I mean, do you know what? Surprisingly, not really. I think maybe because we're still kind of niche, but I talk about this with the students all the time, and I've never had pushback from the students about this. And I've always said, obviously, today we've got the issue of man-made climate change. So the Earth has natural cycles of warmer periods, colder periods. What we've done is really amplify that. And I've never had any pushback, touch wood, on students who are like, no, that is not how I understand the world. It's like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. In fact, if it does anything, it broadens out their perspective and helps them see it as a more holistic process and helps them understand the arguments that they see in the news today a lot better. And I would say as well that one of the scary things is that you often see in the news people talking about the temperature conditions from the pre-industrial period. And as a medievalist, I'm like, well, what is the pre-industrial period? Right. And what is that baseline you're working with? Are you working from a Little Ice Age? In which case, oh, wow, things are even worse than we might previously have thought, because now we're in global warming and maybe we're naturally in a really bad ice age, and the difference is even more profound. Or maybe we are in a warm period, but what is this pre-industrial? And you see that, if you're aware of it, you see it time and time again in news reporting of the climate crisis. They talk about the pre-industrial baselines. What is that? The Middle Ages is there. We just might not know.
Well, thank you so much, Vicky, for joining us for a wonderful discussion on archaeology and history and castles in Ireland and in Europe. Where can people find out more about your research and about the projects that you're working on?
So as I mentioned, my book, The Irish Tower House, is published by Manchester University Press, and it's in paperback, so it's often on special for only like $25, so it's a pretty cheap buy. I also did, for the Great Courses, a Great Castles of Europe series, and that is available to stream through their app. And that is 24 hours of castle goodness, and again, only scraping the surface. I'm also on Blue Sky, if anybody wants to follow me on Blue Sky, and that is my academic social media, and I will be posting updates of the Helm project and our discoveries from fieldwork on Blue Sky.
You also have an edited collection on Irish archaeology in honor of Terry Berry, do you not?
I do indeed. That came out 2 years ago with Brill, and indeed I also have another edited collection, Space and Settlement in Medieval Ireland, which deals with many of the same themes. So yes, if you want to go to my Towson University profile, you'll find a full list of my publications there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Vicky, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Larissa. Thank you.
And this has been Medieval, Mischief, and Mayhem. I'm your host, Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I look forward to seeing you for our next episode.